Hey there, Georgie here with Ukraine Matters. As we explained previously, situation on the front line for Ukraine coming into 2026 is generally pretty stable. There are no immediate dangers and there are just kind of looming threats that we already discussed in the last frontline update. So today we're going to quickly recap the frontline situation, but more importantly, we're going to focus on the specific military aspects that it is important for us to know going deeper into 2026. Let's begin. So first things first, the situation around Huliai. We had reports that Ukrainians have counterattacked in the area, and it was unclear whether these counterattacks were successful or not. Now we more or less know that unfortunately the counterattacks were not successful and Russians were able to hold their positions in Huliai, obviously given that it's a big fight for them. But now with Russians advancing a little bit further also in the area, everyone is looking forward to what we should be aware of. And the most kind of threatening thing that people want to point out first is the Orikhiv, that is the defense line for Ukrainians, preventing essentially Russians to move closer to Zaporizhia, and second is the highway around Pokrovsk, which is right over here. So after Russians will probably at some point advance further than Huliai, what we should be on the lookout for is Russians moving kind of north of Orikhiv to kind of encircle it from this side. And second, there is a river that goes right over here, so we would expect Russians kind of move along this river upwards towards Pokrovsk to cut off this highway and prevent Ukrainians from resupplying by using this road and essentially close this pocket. But I do want to note that generally speaking, advances in the area for Russians have slowed down and they are now comparable to the pressure Russia is putting on Ukrainians across other directions. Despite all of the claims that Pokrovsk and Mirnograd have been captured by Russians, there are still fighting in the north side of Pokrovsk and also some north side of Mirnograd. But again, I do expect Ukrainians to slowly pull out, and this has been already happening. As you can see, in general, Ukrainians have stabilized sort of at the front line. The big question always have been whether or not Ukrainians will be able to kick Russians out from Rodinsk and Krasny Liman. Unfortunately, they were not able to, so that didn't allow Ukrainians to continue having presence in the north side of Pokrovsk. Henceforth, we are now getting the preparations for moving towards the next defensive positions for Ukraine. Around Konstantinivka and Chasiv Yar, Russians are advancing. There is more and more fighting that are reported on the southeastern outskirts of Konstantinivka, and interestingly, Russians also made some progress just north of Chasiv Yar. Chasiv Yar is still staying a bigger problem for Ukraine. I know that the name of the settlement itself has already been kind of colored red, but actually there is a pretty decent portion of Chasiv Yar, which is located in this area right over here, that Russians would probably need to take. Right now, it's very clear that Russians try to kind of push further and maybe then kind of undercut the defensive positions of Konstantinivka and Chasiv Yar to kind of move to this area and close the pocket like this. Then around the Siversk front line, right now, Ukrainians more or less try to hold the positions, but the pocket closing still continues. Right now, the biggest kind of activity is around this area right over here. It's just south of Yampil, the kind of the bigger gateway settlement. And these two settlements of Zakitne and Kriva, they are the one that are basically holding kind of like this part of the pocket. If they are captured in coming days or weeks, then we might see this pocket being captured by Russia, and this will allow them to finally reach some of the higher ground that they really want and move on the high ground to kind of get into this position and start sieging the Kramatorsk-Sloviansk fortification of Ukraine. But again, this is the plan of Russians. It will take them really long time to get there. Around Lyman, we see some developments on the southeastern aspect of Lyman, as you can see from Yampil. So Russians are already actively probing the outskirts of this gateway town, but also there have been movements from Russians from Zarychne towards the center positions, and they're trying to kind of move towards Lyman from the northern direction. Their least successful direction is the northwestern one around here, where they have pretty limited success. So battle for Yampil, as I explained before, has actually begun, and this is what's going to define 2026, at least definitely the first half. And then closing in on the Kupiansk front line, where Ukrainians are clearing out some of the last fortified positions of Russians in Kupiansk. Russians are still trying to resupply them. More than that, there are reports that Russians are trying to conduct more attacks from the north towards Kupiansk. They're using right now the weather with the river frozen over. They are basically crossing the river on foot, and this allows some more supplies being and forces being brought into the area than it would be otherwise with the boats or any kind of wet crossings, so to say. So in this case, Russians just have a little bit of window opportunity, but Ukrainians are stating that despite all of their efforts, the Ukrainian pilots are still controlling the area, and they have not really had any success whatsoever. So overall, as you can see, no major encirclements of Ukrainians, no major breakthrough, nothing like this. It's just a regular fighting that is happening all across the front line, where Ukrainians are trading the territory for the Russian buddies. And we're gonna talk specifically about the Russian buddies, because while we can see the movements on the front line on the map, it is hard for us to underestimate how well or bad Ukraine is doing. And it's always important to measure how Russia is achieving the goals that it's putting forward. And so far, every year, whatever Russia goals and objectives have been putting on the line, none of them have been really achieved in any amount of decent ways. And we talked about territory already on this channel. We're going to talk about it at some point as well, so please subscribe. But today we're going to touch upon the other aspect that is important to consider, which is manpower. We know that Ukraine is having issues with manpower. It's a big, difficult topic. The biggest red herring that you hear about the topic is that Ukraine just doesn't mobilize young men. It's an absolute nonsense. That is not where the main issues with Ukrainian military lie. The biggest issues is the issues with command and control and motivation and the AWOL charades that are happening all across the Ukrainian recruitment centers. It's a problem that now have been underscored by Budanov, but we're going to talk about it during the news update, hopefully tomorrow. But it's important to also recognize that Russia is also having issues with the manpower. We need to see what was the goal of Russia for 2025 to get the manpower. In 2025, Russia really wanted to scale up their forces significantly. Specifically, they wanted not only supply enough forces to the front line, but also they wanted to get some strategic reserves if they needed to do some kind of operations. The biggest question obviously comes to everyone is whether or not they will attack the Baltics, and this was basically the strategic force that Russia wanted to make to attack the Baltics. And for Russian plans, it's important to kind of recognize, for Russian plans, what they wanted to get is they wanted to get 17 divisions of forces. A division on paper is about 12,000 men. Now, Russian divisions nowadays is nowhere near 12,000 men. It's at best somewhere around 8,000. So they are a lot fewer than before. But the plan was 17 divisions and I believe something like 9 different specialized brigades. From what we now know, the reality, right, compared to reality, from the planned 17 divisions, Russia was able to form only 4, and apparently no specialized brigades whatsoever extra. What this tells us is a massive issues of what Russia has planned and what Russia has achieved. You might ask, well, why is that? And the answer is very simple, because we know that Russia executed and actually over-executed their plan for about 106% of their plan for recruitment. Russia planned to recruit about 408,000 manpower. That's what they wanted to get. We know that by the end of the year, they were able to recruit somewhere around 60 to 470,000 Russian troops. So what we have here is a different divergence of what Russia wants, what Russia achieved, and what was the plan. Because logic is very simple. If Russia achieved their recruitment plan, so why then there is such a big difference between what they wanted to form with this manpower and what they actually formed with that manpower? It's a very accurate question to ask, and this question tells us exactly what is the issue. Because the issue is that Ukraine is using a lot of very good and important tactics to fight the Russians, and specifically second half of the year with the Magyar's unmanned system forces, the targeting of the manpower became very critical. At the start of the year, netto gain of Russia was roughly 10,000 troops per month that Russia was gaining on the front line, plus in the reserves additionally. By the end of 2025, this went down to just plus 3,000 that they started gaining per month. So over the last year, we saw Russian essentially net positive score, drop down from 10,000 to just 3,000. And then we also know that they wanted to form a lot of reserves, but they couldn't do that because Ukrainians are just destroying so many Russians on the front line. And interesting here is when you look at the data on reported Russian casualties at the start of the year, you see weirdly higher numbers per day of killed and wounded Russians than you see at the end of the year. Yet we observe more Russian casualties now. Why is that? And the answer is very simple. Firstly, at the start of the year, Ukrainian reporting was very dubious. There was a lot of the Russian tactics that they used with for example, APCs, and then Ukrainians would destroy these APCs, which is great because it removed a lot of the Russian armor. However, a lot of the troops inside of those APCs would actually get just light wounds, and very often they also would be able to kind of get some evac and get back to the base. They still had a lot of issue with dying, but the ratio was more classical. So people estimated it was very close to classic 3-to-1 ratio, where for every 3 wounded, you get 1 dead person. Now, Russia has changed the tactics at the second part of the 2025, where instead of using armored columns, they started using these infiltration tactics by using these small groups. And we saw the drop in casualties for Russians, surprisingly, per day to somewhere around like 1,000 per day. It was lower at first, then it was a bit higher, but now it's hovering around there. The problem for Russians was that these 1,000 no longer were the guarded troops inside of the APCs. These troops were moving on foot, and whenever drones struck people from these groups, then this 1,000 was actually pretty much dead or extremely heavily wounded. By this point, the reports are that number of Russian wounded, especially stormtroopers, is truly approaching almost zero. The only Russian lightly wounded personnel usually comes from being near explosions from artillery somewhere behind the lines where Ukrainians are dropping. For when it comes to the storm forces that Russia is using on the front line, they are pretty dead. And this is why Russia requires fresh meat non-stop. This is exactly why, despite the fact that Russia is stating that they're forming some strategic reserves, as we see 4 divisions, they're located right now closer to the Baltic states around the St. Petersburg-Moscow region. But more importantly is that Ukraine is putting Russia in conditions where meat grinder depends on more and more and more meat per day. So current trend are not very positive for Russia. The getting changes done in side of Ukrainian military, focusing more on the strike drones, hitting more the manpower. I believe very, very soon, by the mid of the year, we might see the actual shift where Russia will start losing manpower compared to gaining, which will absolutely thwart any kind of strategic reserves that they want to make, which will thwart all of their approaches. This will not stop Russia. They still have reserves, not just strategic, but also operational one. And I think that despite the Ukrainian efforts, this year we will see still Russian advances on the front line. Big check will be around the mid-date, like around July, where we can kind of look once again. So to sum up, when you start looking beyond the coloring red on the map, then you start seeing that Russia indeed has major issues, that plans that they're making are never being achieved. I mean, only 4 divisions that are not even full divisions, and there are questions to what kind of equipment those divisions are getting, because Russia has also equipment issue, but that's a whole another topic. And you see that it becomes more and more problematic for Russia to conduct this war. And nothing suggests that it's going to become easier. Everything says that it's only going to get worse. And to help Ukrainian armed forces reach their targets this year, to see the Russians getting reduced out of Ukraine, please participate in a fundraiser. We are doing great. The guys are already making first batches of drones. I just got a report today, so we're going to see some reports on that very, very soon. Guys, I love you. Slava Ukraini, trust in Ukrainian armed forces, and I will see you next time.